Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
As if they weren't bumps. I think we've also once shouted at each other over the phone. But all that aside,
I think you must have done most of the shouting.
no, I think no. I think it's fair. Both of us, I think, shouted. But I think so. So in collaborations like this, first of all, there must be first a kind of broad, common intellectual understanding and convergence on some of the. Devesh and I have been, although we've actually written and researched the book over, actually been thinking about it and discussing it for at least a decade, if not more. And over that period, we've come to, the basic framework is kind of commonly understood. One. Second, I think that our own independent research, I've always been a great admirer of all the work that Devesh did, well before he met me, his work on the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, his work on, how the market and growth, how it changed society in India. So I was a very great admirer of Devesh's earlier work as well. And so therefore, coming together. And then, of course, the process requires that mutual trust that, the other person, believes in, but will also be open to change when, through argument and persuasion. I think that's, the basic, understanding. But Ram, on this, I shouldn't forget this on the collaborative process. I think we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge at least 10, 15, 25 young researchers who are part of this. Some of them are here. Vargesh, of course, has been with us for 4 years. Abhishek is also here, and there are several others. So this kind of work could not be done without. And I think the nice thing is that many of these researchers I knew, many of them Devesh knew, but at the end of the process, they've all got to know each other and get well. So I should acknowledge that part of the collaborative.
No, you do thank, very generously all the people who helped you, both younger than you, your people older than you. But still, essentially, the two of you would have, done the weaving and the knitting and all of that. So, Devesh, you'd like to say something on this? Because it is, it is a, in your field, or in his field, in economics and political science, and of course in the sciences, it's even more common to write joint papers, right? And you have percent was two people or two others, and the book also on Dalits, it was also with two people. But with due respect to those books, both of which are important, they're not at this scale, right? So it is still one of the things that I found really, really impressive was how you carried off, and as I said, the way stylistically too, and analytically, and ideologically or non-ideologically, there is a kind of continuity and a seamlessness. So I'd like to use this also, because it is really, that's one of the most remarkable features of this book, is how you carried off such a stupendous exercise, and only had the occasional shouting match. He only mentioned one, there may be one or two others, but tell us a little bit about how you saw the collaboration.
Well, I think sort of Arvind would joke it's a collaboration between a bhaiya and a hard charging time ram, and sort of lazy bhaiya. One is Arvind brings an extraordinary creativity for all these years. In some ways, a collaboration like this is like a marriage. Rocky moments, but to make it work, you need trust and mutual respect. Without that, So one of the things is that, as I said, individual chapters, each one of us had a primary, but then you gave it to your co-author who could change anything, modify, add, and you had to and accept it. It's not about you, but about improving the product. So I think unless you have fundamental sort of respect in who you're working with, otherwise, you think when we write, oh, we've worked so hard and we're very possessive of it. So you have to really let go of that and trust your colleague, co-collaborator, co-author, that he has better ideas and he's trying to.
On that, I want to say two things. One, when you says you have to let go of your ego, that's a much bigger challenge for me than for Devesh, because Devesh is inherently a very.
But there's a reason for that. And that the fact that you have a bigger ego than him has got very little to do with you being a tambram and he being a bhaiya. It's to do that he has spent much more of his life as a teacher.
That may be true. I think let's not go too much into that. I think some things might come out. The other, I think, important thing is that there's one very important complementarity in the collaboration. So obviously we've read a lot to write this, but Devesh, because of his all, has poured through literally about 3,000 plus government documents written from 1947 to today. Now, there were two spin-offs from that. One, of course, the book is informed, we tried hard, and this is a lesson also we picked up from Ram's book. If you read the introduction to India after Gandhi, is that, when you write something like this historical, it's very easy to pass judgment with the condescension of posterity, to quote Linda Colley, but instead to have the perspective of how was it when decisions were being taken in the present, and reading those documents that Devesh had, I think brought that sense of perspective. Just in the book, we a phrase which we use, that the Indian state was remarkably self-reflective, consistently self-reflective. It was frequently self-flagellating, but only rarely self-correcting. But the first part of that, saying that it's self-reflecting, is because Devesh had actually gone through all these documents to convince me or to show me that everything had been thought about. The second spin-off, of course, is that whenever one thing we try to do about the data in this book, which I think maybe may not have been done to the same extent before, is anything that we say in the book, we try and present data from as early as possible. And because Devesh had read all these documents, for example, anytime I wanted data on anything, I would just have to ask Devesh, and he would say in the 1964 Lok Sabha start question number 1722 had exactly this, and Devesh would find that. And so I think that was also very much part of our collaborative effort.
So just one postscript to what you said, Devesh, and then I'll come to my next question. You said it's like a marriage. Now, I can say with some, I come to the next question. The next question is slightly long, not preamble. So this is the preamble. Your book, I mean, one is like understated and subtle. That if you look at say the 70 years of years, or at least till 2014, even beyond 2014, that they have brought the first period, 25, 30 years, where so democracy and pluralism were nurtured, maybe not perfectly, but very substantially, given the unpropitious initial conditions in which India was born. So you could say that the first 30, 35 years created the emotional infrastructure of the integrative emotional infrastructure of the nation quite successfully. But those early decades were substantially below par when it came to the economy, human development, and possibly also state capacity when it came to welfare. Now, when you come to the next 30 odd years, impressive economic growth, albeit services we may talk about later in the discussion. 15 years especially, impressive development of physical and digital infrastructure. But yet, on the other side, a steady degradation of democracy and pluralism. Certainly of some institutions, possibly even the Election Commission of India. So, if you look at the broad arc of the ability of the Indian state has increased in decades, but its ability to act impartially. So, my question is really addressed to you. I think you can answer it much better. So, he would have his too. Is that, I mean, this is an old, of course, in your field, political science, this tentative conclusion that there is indeed a necessary trade-off. But the question, do we accept that? Could we have had more development from the 50s, 70s, or 80s? And could we not had could we have it while developing economically and physically and infrastructurally? Could democratic and secular backsliding in recent decades? So, in terms of this trade-off between democracy and development, what do you learn or learn from this long arc of history? Which you
So I think one of the things, Ram, we need to think about, we often use democracy to elections. And that, I think, has perhaps an important, not the, but an important reason why democracy itself has, in some ways, has. I think, once our sort of mutual friend, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, said that is also about a sensibility, especially in the leadership, where there is a degree of acceptance, of tolerance, of where opponents are not enemies. And you are willing to compromise. I mean, especially in a system, as we say, 1/6 of all the diversity, compromise is the heart of building a nation. And one of the things we show is that forging with a very card deck that you were dealt with, despite innumerable compromises, despite he not want linguistic states, he was not in favor of reservation, of caste sense, all those things. He came to accept it because those compromises were essential. And that part of what we might exposed see it as weaknesses were actually strengths. Because compromise is fundamental, and that's the democratic sensibility. I think our emphasis on democracy is about elections. It's been reduced to that. And that has been very costly, I think, to us, both on how we think about democracy and democracy itself. I'm not sure if I.
No, you.
So about all the decline later on in democratic, whatever, I'll leave that to Devesh. But the first part of your question was, why, despite democracy, did we not get economic growth, and is there a trade-off between the two or not? So, of course, I think in one big sense there was, which is that all major countries in East Asia, the ones that did really well, were very successful in enacting land reforms right at the start. East Asia, Taiwan, Japan before that, China, they all had land reform, and they were all authoritarian states that undertook land reform. India attempted land reform. The first wave, zamindari, was reasonably successful, but then, of course, it ran up against, quote unquote, democracy, or at least the democracy as led by the Congress Party, because, as you know, land reform, land is a state subject. The Congress comprised elite landed gentry, and therefore, land reforms after a certain point got stymied, and we never created the conditions in agriculture for rapid agricultural growth and productivity growth. So in that sense, the quote from Pratap Mehta, which we use in the book, the price of democracy is the absence of revolution in this sense. However, the other major choices that were made that set back the economy had nothing to do with democracy. Import substitution, planning, etc., were just part of the ideological zeitgeist of the time, and especially with our leadership looking Russia, looking to China, rather than looking east towards Korea, Taiwan, Japan. And of course the welfare state in Europe after World War II, and so they adopted this, which was therefore nothing to do with democracy, just the ideological zeitgeist and the preferences of our leaders as well. There too, of course, as Devesh was saying, there were differences amongst, some wanted more Vallabhbhai Patel were not so keen on that. But the last one of the, one of the choices was made period, economic choice, had nothing to do with democracy and nothing to do with the zeitgeist of, which is the following. When all countries in Latin America, China, said we will shut ourselves off from foreign competition, everyone did that. Nothing unusual about that. But all these countries, and the technical term is called import substitution, that is, you keep away imports and nurture and favor domestic industry, they all try to do that. But we said we will shut off the foreign competition, but also not allow our domestic private sector to succeed. So industrial licensing was a choice stated by democracy, nor by ideology, but whatever the particular configuration. And it turned out to be the worst policy choices and the least forgivable of the policy choices because it was not either of the two.
I had a terminological amendment to what you said. It was not that industrial licensing was imposed with the view we will not let the private sector succeed. It was we will not let different elements of the private sector compete against one another. That may be a better way of putting it.
Maybe, but see
the state will dispense favors, as to who is to get what.
Well, see, I think there are two things. I think the good point. Two things is that one, the overall framework is the private sector will be severely regulated and thwarted. And then because you've created scarcity, then you get the discretion then to say who will get the licenses, who doesn't get the license, so on. But the overall impact was so. I think the important point to recognize is here is that there was a kind of internal contradiction between saying we're going to, keep away foreign competition to promote domestic entrepreneurship and at turn around at the same time stifle domestic private entrepreneurship.
Can I
Yeah,
add?
please. Yeah.
So actually, as Harvind said, no democratic government has ever done land reform. Land reform has only occurred in authoritarian or revolutionary states.
Or colonial states,
Yeah.
like Japan and Korea.
Right.
Yeah.
Second, and which came more as a surprise to us, primary education, which was the other big failure of that period. Primary education expansion also has only occurred in countries which did not have universal franchise, meaning the phase of in the West, in Japan, China, all the countries, now there's very good work showing that the real expansion of primary education occurred in periods prior to universal franchise. Because we had universal franchise straight away, and of course had abysmal primary education at that time, that is consistent with the broader international evidence. So we paid a price on two key fronts: primary education, and therefore.
Just small, The quickly the thing, No, the thing is that on the Devesh is absolutely right on the general principle that even education has not been done. The exception, of course, is Kerala, where a combination of historical factors and social movements that led to expansion. While Kerala was good even at the start, the progress it made under democracy was also very impressive. So just note that Kerala is a bit of an exception. And on the land reform, Ram, you will know better that actually the earliest and most successful land reform in India was by Sheikh Abdullah in Kashmir, and it was a authoritarian thing as well.
So there's so much to discuss, and so I'd like to move on to something less broad and general than democracy versus development. And a real hallmark of this book, again, among them, I should have actually said at the beginning, the fifth way in this book stands out, is it very illuminating, and carefully worked out comparative approach. So it's India versus other countries, which Arvind and Devesh have alluded to in the last answer. So it's Taiwan, Korea, China, Indonesia. There's a very interesting chart showing how we've done much worse than Indonesia in several respects. So which are completely revealing to me. So that's one part of it, but we won't discuss it because there's so much to discuss. The other really fascinating way in which this book is truly comparative in a new and original and compelling way is the different states of India compared against one another. So one of the most best chapters of the book, at least for me, I mean others will have their other favorites. But I think about this book is you can all you like the whole book, but some things will particularly resonate with you. One of the favorite chapters for me was on the many Indias within India. This is an issue which is really important intellectually. Unity, the Republic of India. I'll post you, Arvind. Is it fair to pose it as basically an economically dynamic South and West against an economically regressive Northeast axis, with some exceptions like say, the NCR? Would that be broadly accurate? South and West versus North and East?
Um, I think broadly, but I think there are two exceptions. First thing, I think, Ram, I think one should say is that what was very, very surprising to both Devesh and me is that when we talk about the success of the South and the West, and we have to include NCR, which is Haryana, but we should also talk about Punjab, which is interesting in a kind of success until 1990. I mean, the most successful, and then the collapse. So we'll come to that in a second. The first thing to note about that peninsular success of broadly peninsular India is that we say in the book, and what we discovered is that 1/3 of India, this roughly this South and West, grew at Chinese rates of growth and for or as long as China. So for about 35 years, these states, the four southern states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, to some extent Haryana, have grown at about 7 to 9% for almost 35 to 40 years. And so when people say, oh, wow, India hasn't done as well as China, it's actually not true because 1/3 of India has. It's just that it hasn't spread to the remaining 2/3. But factually, yes, the point is true. And um, when you say, I don't know how much detail we should get into here, but I think the interesting thing when we talk about the successes and the failures is we identify around three failures in terms of the states. I mean, one is the obvious failure of the Hindi heart, and we kind of have a discussion around that. The second failure, and this is what I wanted to come to, is actually Punjab. It meteoric in its rise and absolutely catastrophic in its fall from say 1950 to 1987, 88, before the troubles began. It was absolutely a meteor, richest state in India, rapid agricultural productivity, also industrialization. We saw early industrialization, but then after the events of the 80s and 90s, basically it's been in free fall, and it has now a toxic mix of pathologies which doesn't bode very well for the future. So that's the kind of second failure. The third failure on which I'll let Devesh, because he knows.
Ask him exactly what.
Yeah,
Let him.
yeah,
I know what you
yeah. So
yeah. So I've got. Thank you. I just went to my next question. I've got to ask about some specific states, and what Arvind left unsaid when I rudely stopped him, was we'd like you to speak about West Bengal. Not merely because you grew up in West Bengal. That is also part of why we're asking you this question. But West Bengal was considered the epicenter of all that was progressive in India, right? From Gokhale's famous talk about what Bengal thinks today, but fleshed out in terms of your book, it saw some of the. It was one of the first states to industrialize. It had top-class scientific institutions. So tell us about why one last thing before you tell us about why West Bengal has, failed so dismally over so long. Many years ago, the demographer Ashish Bose, who was my senior colleague at the Institute of Economic Growth, coined the term Bimaru states. Now, many people don't know it was Ashish Bose. And the Bimaru were Bihar, BI, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh. And some other people then make it Bimaru, ROU, and added Odisha. But West Bengal was not there. Now, I don't think it was because Professor Bose was Bengali. I mean, I don't think he was that parochial. somehow in his mind, as in the mind of me and you and Arvind, it is Bengal is, P.C. Rai and Meghnad Saha, let alone Rabindranath Tagore and Satish Ray. So tell us a little bit about why Bengal.
I think Bengal is one of India's most. You spent some time in Calcutta.
That's why I'm interested in the
Yeah.
answer, because I don't have the answer.
Yeah, I don't know if I do either. But ultimately, it's a tremendously sad story. Uh, you know, there's a book, I'm forgetting the name, which sort of names 7 epochs in history where certain places were very, very creative. Vienna at a certain point. One of the cities, interestingly, is Calcutta in the turn of the 20th century. And you absolutely cannot say that 100 years later, right? And the question is why? Now, I think one is, I think we tend to forget that we think of the bloodiness of partition and, of course, Punjab, but actually more refugees came from East Pakistan, and almost all came to Bengal, whereas fewer refugees compared to the East came from the West, and they were far more dispersed. So, one is that huge disruption. The second is, I think, one severe undermining of Bengal's comparative advantage and the East was the freight equalization policy, which really meant that their comparative advantage was really sort of undermined. But the third has to be, and we say it, and I'm sure we'll get lots of brickbats. We say Bengal is the only state that was truly betrayed by its intellect. Who was
I think betrayed in terms of flight also. They're all in America,
Yeah.
teaching left-wing economics in America.
exactly, but they, who were absolutely very, very free and very nicely, all the problems of imperialism. I mean, you and I would grow all these rallies. It's about Cuba and Vietnam, but nothing about what was happening under their nose.
Yeah.
And so, for the left, for the organized sector, where the unions were, where they drew their strength, they forgot that most basic dictum. You cannot have a strong union movement in the organized sector if there is no organized sector. And once capital fled, it never came back. But what then made it much worse from the 90s onwards, for 100 years, people from around the India came to Calcutta. From the 90s, every young Bengali who is educated and is ambitious wants to leave the state, right? And there's no better indicator of a country's or any place's future if the young don't see that place as part of their future. And what is more paradoxical is, Bengal is exceptional. It has had only 3 chief ministers since 1977. Usually we think political stability helps in economic development. But here, because they were locked into a particular political ideology, and I have to say, we talk about authoritarianism all over in Delhi and so on, but we really forget how authoritarian Bengal is and its leadership. We also forget that Bengal is an outlier in India in the degree of political violence. We associate political violence with the Hindi belt. Actually, West Bengal has the highest political violence of any state because of its commitment to secularism, which I think is genuine. I think it gets away with that, all the underlying pathologies that have really made it very hard to attract capital. If you can't attract financial capital and your best human capital leaves, it's hard to be successful.
Let's just get into a Bengal bashing thing. I think first one has to remember that India failed on land reforms more generally, but one of the states that was successful in land reform was West Bengal, and I think we should give credit credit
left
to the
side
left
for
for that.
Yeah.
But of course, that only aggravates the paradox, which is that if you think that land reform and equality of land holding is important for long run agricultural growth, having accomplished that, at least some security for the landowner, tenancy being abolished, and so on, why didn't that then translate into first agricultural productivity and then industrial thing? I think that's one point. The last point I would say, just to rephrase what Devesh said, that it's not only that you had political stability, but political stability with the same party for 33 years. And then, of course, that raises the question. It raises two questions. One, paradox of political stability not leading to growth. The second, viewed from the other way, is that how come democracy failed completely? Even electoral democracy failed as an accountability mechanism if over these 33 years you had long-term sustained decline.
I mean, I just add a footnote to that, or a slightly provocative question. Then or comment, because I don't want a response to it. I think continuous rule by one party can often be a problem. I mean, 30 years of the Congress ruling in Delhi, Bengal, and if you look, arguably, over the long haul of economic and social development in India, three states that have performed particularly well, both in economic terms and in terms of human development, are Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Himachal, all of which have had generally alternative. But let me, I have so much to cover, and I also want the audience to, get in. So, you'll excuse me if I move on. Next to the role of institutions and of the justice system in particular. And Devesh, this is something you've studied, you've written, also edited books and written many essays on it. And from your analysis, it appears that India has had a broadly efficient army, efficient and capable, 1962 accepted, but an incompetent police force and a poorly functioning, if not malfunctioning, judiciary. One of the many striking tables in the book shows the pendency rate for police cases, which has increased from 4.6% to 28% from 1961 to 2022. And for the same period, 61 to 2022, the pendency rate for court cases increased from 71 to 90, almost 90. The percentage of prisoners who are under trial has increased from 30% to 75%. Now, the question for you is, would it be fair to describe the justice system as the law for some, especially the rich, but lawlessness for many, especially the poor?
Sort of, absolutely. I think, one of the earlier comments that Arvind made, this whole thing of pendencies in courts and the need to act. There's a report on it by the Law Commission in the 1950s. There are parliamentary reports, Law Commission reports in the 1960s. There are reports in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010s. Every decade, this problem is looked at, analyzed, and the conclusions are broadly similar across. Nothing is done. Or, I won't say nothing, but largely. I think this is the sort of courts and the police reforms. Police also, you get an identical, the same language you will see in reports from the 50s or 70s. And here I think is a case of what might call deliberately engineered failures. These are failures that are, look, having more courts, judges, procedures is not a matter of massive amounts of investment. So it's not about money. Most cases, of course, I think we are unusually obsessed with the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
but for vast numbers of people,
it's
it's
a very
the
important
district.
point.
It's the local.
The
courts.
media, the intellectuals, civil society, all let's go and fight in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and we get very happy when the Supreme Court gives some liberal judgment or this thing, as if the problem has been solved, which is absolutely never the case. For the ordinary person, whether it's a check bouncing case or a land dispute, all of these are local courts. But it should be emphasized, local courts are all state subjects. Police, law and order is a state subject. This is not where the fault lies in Delhi. The question to ask is, why have all states of all political parties for 70 years been completely aware of the problem and have unanimously failed to address it? And I think the answer is because it suits them. It suits them because a weak police means things can be manipulated more easily. Weak courts means that extrajudicial jurisdictions, you go to the politician to get a problem resolved because you're stuck over there. And of course, the rich, whenever things are delayed and drag on for years, for poor litigants, they have to settle.
Yeah.
The rich can afford to drag on, the poor can't. So it's completely, to me, what is the irony is that states that profess to be socialist stand for so-called social justice. These are absolutely at the heart of issues of core social justice. They have been as abysmal failures as those that don't have those protections.
And across parties, across regions, across time period. So my next broad question, both in the introduction and the conclusion to the book, and through parts of the main text itself, you indicate, though you never fully spell out, because no book can do everything, you indicate what you see as a worry, the weakness of civil society. And you have a very nice discussion towards the end about a critical discussion of the attitude of maa-bapism, of citizens expecting the state to do most of the heavy lifting. Now, this maa-bapism has persisted from 1947 to the present, despite economic liberalization. And indeed, one of the few things that Jawaharlal Nehru and Narendra Modi have had in common is that they both have, in one case, implicitly and shamefacedly, in the other case, openly and deliberately, wanted to replace Gandhi as the father of the nation. You know how they kind of act. Right? So they are the protectors, or Nehru was, and Modi is the protector and guarantor of all Indians. Right. So there's that kind of patrimonial aspect to it. Now, I've grappled with a question for myself, which I won't ask you to answer, but I'll just share it with you and with the crowd here. You know, this would this maa-bapism have been weaker? Would civil society have been more proactive if Gandhi had lived another 10 years or so? Because Gandhi was very clear that you needed civil society. You know, civil society had a challenge the state. If you look at some of his last remarks, he says, we will have to launch peaceful satyagraha against our independent government if they don't act on abolishing untouchability and so on and so forth. And one of his last statements was to constitute Lok Sevak Samiti. Now, that's a question, it's an open question, and I've written about it. I think, Vinoba Bhave was a disaster as the legatee of Gandhism because he basically eviscerated civil society. But I have a question for each of you on this whole issue of maa-bapism. And first to you, Arvind. How did this maa-bapism sap entrepreneurial dynamism?
Ram, first of all, I think that, remember, we want to be careful in distinguishing maa-bapism from statism, because this is not something that just is Nehru's fault or Modi's fault or whatever. The point is that they are willing to do this because there is a broader, maa-bapism in society itself.
Correct.
That the state can do very little good, deliver inefficient services. Bangalore water problem is not solved, and yet the target will always be the state. You go back to ask the state to remedy that. So because it's wider and more entrenched, it's therefore more pernicious in its effect and more, and therefore it's very easy to target the state when in some ways kind of we're all implicated in that, and that's why the origins of this, of course, is much more difficult to trace, but it's something there. Now, how is it sapped entrepreneurship, for example? Just a couple of examples from the book itself. So we have a chapter on public sector enterprises, and we have a chapter on banking as well, where both you see manifestations of this my Bapism. So just to give you the banking example, we nationalized the banks in 1969. And if you look over since then for about the last 40, 50 years, most of the more than a majority of the activities of the Indian banking system were related to the state, whether it's to finance the budget, whether it's to undertake social policy, or whether it's lent to the state public sector. So the amount that was left over for private entrepreneurship, the private sector, what's about 20 to 25% roughly of their overall activity. And therefore, the access to financial resources that the private sector had compared to countries like Korea and Taiwan that we document was just a fraction. The credit to GDP ratio going to, the lending to the private sector, 25%. In Korea, it's 150% and 200%. So that's a sense in which I think my Bapism. But a deeper and my second example would be I'll give the following example and make it current. Take the power sector in India, even today. My Bapism takes two forms today in India, in the power sector. One is to give free subsidy or free power to the poor. And in turn, because of that, we tax manufacturing in the sense that manufacturing on average pays double the price of power that it should in any efficient society. Now, here's the paradox. The thing is, and this is where I think the My Bapism is really a thing. So, in the book as well, and more recent work, if you look at the subsidies that are given, this is, by the way, and this is a state subject. So, this is almost true across all of India. Let's say 100 is given out in subsidies for households, right? True socialism would say that you should give it to the poor. But guess how much of the 100 actually goes to the poor in India? It's probably about 20 to 25%. 60 to 70% of the power subsidies go to the middle class and the rich. There is nothing about ordinary socialism that would say that you should do this. And the only way you can explain it is this notion that, the statism is so deep that we think it's legitimate for the state also to give these subsidies to the middle class and the rich. Final point here is that the other way in which this electricity sector affects this is there's a kind of inefficiency factor, of pretty substantial inefficiency factor. Now, this is true not just of power, but in a chapter on public enterprise that we document throughout. The puzzle is that getting into the the state doing a lot of economic activity was certainly not unusual by any stretch, especially when it began. But over time, and we show this in the book, the returns to this investment have been so poor consistently over time. And by the way, a point is that in this, and yet despite that, we don't get any, it has never been self-correcting, as we said. And one of the explanations we offer is that we never, this my Bapism is so entrenched that we don't hold the public sector of the state accountable.
Devesh, I want to ask you about the impact of this My Bapism on tapping citizens' initiatives and the vigor of civil society. Can you briefly dwell on that?
So, take two areas. One, you're very familiar, which is environment. The other is primary education. So there was a well-known work by Elinor Ostrom. She got the Nobel Prize in economics, like for this work, that certain goods are co-produced between the state, citizens, and primary education is an example, right? Those of you who have children know that schooling is only one of the sites where a child learns. Child learns from their peers, a child learns at home, right? You need all three in order to improve the learning outcomes. Part of the thing about schooling is always been, and one of the big failures of our democracy is we always look at why the state failed. But then why didn't society have demanded? After all, their children are being affected.
Right.
If learning outcomes are poor, your child is his future is going to be bleaker. Why aren't you demanding that the teacher is who is paid the government teacher way more than the private counterpart is not showing up at school? You're willing to really go out if a certain statue of someone is garlanded with something and you're willing to protest. You're willing to go into a riot if someone says X or Y, but you're completely unwilling to go out and protest if your child is getting a terrible education or if the sanitation is crappy in the streets and your health is going to be affected. That, I think, is where the my papism comes. You expect these things to come from the state, and it's now become such a deeply rooted notion that the demand side, your right as a citizen, it cannot just be a gift of the state to the people. If you do not demand your rights as a citizen, the supply side will be weak.
I just had a modest defense of the lack of civil society initiative. Is the coercive powers used by the state to throttle civil society. You know, FCRA
Right.
and all of that. But anyway,
Yeah.
that. But I have several questions I can't get to, and we certainly want the audience to participate. But I have a couple of questions at the end, not non-serious, but less serious than the ones that have come so far. So, Devesh, first a question for you. You know, one of the issues about the way the media narrative, the popular narrative, even part of the academic narrative, has oriented, as you said, I mean, one of the great things your book does is take it away from Delhi to all the states. But the search for a great redemptive leader is, always there. So after Nehru, who? Then after Indira, who? After Modi, who? And it has to be other work. Is should the whole discourse about leadership and capable, efficient leadership that delivers should be reoriented towards the states, and should citizens have aimed for in the past, and should they still hope for 10 capable chief ministers rather than one great redemptive prime minister? I'll add a footnote to that. I mean, arguably, if you look at, Nehru, of course, did great work in his first few years, but after that, if you look at the uncharismatic prime ministers, Lal Bahadur Shastri to begin with, Narasimha Rao, Vajpayee was partly charismatic, but only partly charismatic. But Manmohan Singh kind of equaled Narasimha Rao in the uncharismatic stakes. You know, as they used to say about Narasimha Rao, he had the charisma of a dead fish. And if you look at a balance sheet, maybe the uncharismatic prime ministers have possibly performed even slightly better than the charismatic ones. But should we really be looking at, should every Kannadiga say we want, a chief minister who is better than Devarajan, or in Tamil Nadu, a chief minister who is as good as or better than Annadurai or Kamaraj, rather than that kind of the leadership question. So I'd like your reflection on this.
Well,
Shouldn't we provincialize the leadership question?
Well, if you want charismatic leadership, look like to the United States right
Yes.
now. I mean, one of the sort of things we end the book with. So the book is not at all prescriptive. The last chapter is, I think, 5 pages out of the 750. We focus on just one, if you want to call it, prescription for the leadership class, which is to take a bit of the Hippocratic oath to do no harm. As much when we think about leadership, it's as important to have this sense, do no harm. Allow your citizens to do what they want to do. And that alone can go a long way. Great leader in Delhi or 10 chief ministers. I think we would argue that in this century, at least going forward, as we urbanize, we need 3,000 charismatic city leaders. The real engines of growth will be urban areas. You know what's happening in Bangalore way better than us. And our cities have been so stymied we show that the real problem of centralization in India is not Delhi versus the states, but the states vis-a-vis their local bodies, especially their urban local bodies, because the 74th Amendment has been basically completely.
Eviscerated. Yeah.
And I think if you're a sixth of humanity, you need a far broader
Right.
cross-section of leadership
Leadership, yeah.
at different.
Absolutely.
It
Well said.
diversifies risk. It brings more engines of growth.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Very well said. So, Arvind, the last question for you. One of the book's thesis, major thesis, is on what you call precocious servification, which very simply to a non-economist like me means if you look at the trajectory that other countries have successfully followed when it comes to economic development, they've developed a robust manufacturing sector. So it's not just true of the first industrializers of Western Europe and Latin, North America, but also China and Korea and Taiwan, and then services. Whereas here we've really succeeded much more in services than manufacturing. So my question to you is, given our precocious servification, could we say provocatively that Bangalore's success was India's failure?
I was about to say I should be careful in the Bangalore audience in answering.
You can say anything.
Yeah,
we are not as thin-skinned as other parts of India. We are not like, I won't name the states, but you know what the states I mean. You can say what you want.
So let me say, just three things about 3 points on this question. One is that one attitude could be that, we couldn't do manufacturing successfully, especially low-skill manufacturing. So thank God we could at least do services. So count your blessings. Otherwise the counterfactual may have been not manufacturing over services, but neither manufacturing nor services, which would have left us infinitely worse off. That's point one. Point number two is that to a Bangalore audience, and the startup, tech, whatever, the absolutely dynamic, innovative audience, I would say that, if you look at the numbers on, Bangalore is a great city. We've done a lot of things that, even if this is extraordinarily successful, double Chinese, rates of growth because of services, by definition, it's going to be non-inclusive growth. So in that sense, it's not that Bangalore is at the expense of India, but Bangalore is only Bangalore, and it cannot, help, the rest of India. So that's point number two. That's why employment-intensive growth has to be the focus of any strategy, and we failed comprehensively on this. The last point is the most subtle, and the point which actually vindicates what Ram said. So about 20 years ago, I did some research with several authors, including Raghu and things, and we wrote a piece in the Financial Times from that academic paper where we called this the Bangalore bug. The Bangalore bug, in economics, there's a phenomenon called the Dutch disease. So in the Netherlands, when the price of oil went up, the country became very rich with oil, but because the currency became very strong, the manufacturing sector got devastated because of that. The equivalent in India is Bangalore, in the sense that because services were very successful, two things happened. The exchange rate became much more stronger, which hurt manufacturing. And the second thing is the common pool of talent for manufacturing and services, supervisors, designers, architects, which both need, the prices of those got bid up extraordinarily, and that also made manufacturing less successful and less competitive. So it's in that sense that Bangalore came partially at the expense of India. But the last point I want to make is that here, that we document another example of why manufacturing was affected, which is that the government labor market in India acts a bit like Bangalore, in the following sense. What Bangalore did was make our manufacturing somewhat less competitive than it should. The government labor market, because it has bid up, if you look at government salaries at the lower end, they are well above what an equivalent would earn in the private sector. So having this government labor market dominating everything with very high wages at the lower end makes manufacturing competitive. So Bangalore has come partly at the expense of the rest of India. The Mai Baap Sarkar and the way we've designed the state has also come partly at the expense of manufacturing.
Thank you. So I have several questions that I'm not going to ask. I am going to observe a very uncharacteristic and unnatural rectitude.
Is getting to middle income status, say of around say 8,000 GDP per cap for India, I guess that's Thailand levels, realistic for us by 2047? And if it is, what are the 3 to 5 things we need to do?
So I don't think you need to get into prescription. Are you happy?
I'll say
Okay,
that
quickly,
we will not answer the second question in the spirit of the book, where we're not going to give you 1, 2, and 3, because
Yeah.
Devesh and I will disagree on that ourselves about that. But the short answer is you need a miracle to achieve that, or putting it less politely, very, very difficult, for one very simple reason. To get that status, India has to grow for the next 22 years, whatever it is, at about 6 to 6.5% per capita GDP. India has never done that, except for a very brief period. And to do that, we need much better policies. We need more inclusive manufacturing growth. And also, we need a more favorable external environment. When we achieved that growth, we had that combination: a favorable external environment, a lot of reforms, a lot of investment, which together gave us that. But you need that for about 25 years, which is going to be very difficult.
So,
Quick question. So we talked about the MyBab, so this reliance, in fact, and so my question
Not
was
the company. No, you mean not the company?
not. Yeah. So my question was essentially, where do you see opportunity? Again, not prescriptive, but from history and from other countries having done the same.
Ask about the past. We don't want to get
Okay,
in.
about the past. Yeah.
Your curiosity about the past,
Yeah.
rather than your
What
impatience
have
with
been
solutions.
cases where, for example, societies that risked the disillusionment of sort of like, oh, it's never going to change, things are like stagnant and so on, where have, let's say, other countries leapfrogged when it comes to civic society participation, or like solving the problem of city governance, all of that stuff? Like,
So
Yeah.
so your question is,
Where
have
the-
there been any successes in the past?
specifically where there were gaps in the past and you were not constrained by how things were, and therefore you could sort of leapfrog.
Yeah.
Think of the landline versus the mobile, that's all.
So I'm not sure if I fully understood the question.
Yeah.
So was it that there were countries that had certain gaps and found ways, creative ways to overcome those gaps? Broadly. So as you mentioned, I mean, technology has always been one. One area that one other thing I've been working the last year is the World Bank's World Development Report. I was the lead academic, and this year it's coming out next month. It's a topic that actually should interest the tech community here. It's on standards and development. And standards is everything from the quality of steel that you use in sort of rail lines to compatibility standards for the internet, etc. So much of the failures in safety, say in the 19th century, boiler explosion in the first industrial revolution, those standards came from professional bodies that were newly formed. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the American Society of Testing and Materials, right? So professional bodies, they got together, doctors for public health, lawyers around laws. One of the things I think, and Ram, it would be great to hear from you, is that India, we developed these professional
It's a
societies,
terrific point. Yeah.
but they have actually been the Indian National Science Academy. When does the government go to them for help on any major scientific issue? We have not, that's one area that civil society definitely can do more to strengthen that, to provide inputs on increasingly complex technical issues.
So that's very important. And that's a very good point you make. That one is, of course, is it that unlike in America, and by the way, Devesh started as an engineer. Is it that our professional bodies have not been proactive? The institutional engineer just has a annual meeting and gives a lifetime award and does nothing else, or quite a lot of it would be the government not asking them. Many of our governments are knowledge proof. I mean, I give an example from Bangalore. Now we are discussing this underground road. Now I wonder if the government has consulted the leading engineers in the Indian Institute of Science. And I suspect the answer is no. Right. And likewise with the coastal road in IIT, what the IIT, in Bombay, what the IIT. So I think that's really everything. So this whole interface between government and expertise, civil society, I think has also been historically been one of our deficiencies. Again, I would say, Devesh, across political regimes, political parties. There's a question there.
So this stems from that argument or the thought that democracy and development are at odds with each other. Is it partly because the development that we see is we are defining it in an economic sense, which is inherently competitive, and democracy is inherently collaborative? So maybe this Western concept of development that we are using, is that the reason why it looks that both of them are at odds? Maybe if we look at something like a Gandhian utopia, then if we define development as progress towards that, then maybe democracy and development wouldn't be at odds with each other. Is that?
That's a fascinating question. Maybe both of you would like to answer it.
No, so first, I think I really don't think so. We said that democracy and development are at odds. They can be at odds in certain specific cases. But we argue very strongly that in India's case, actually, democracy was absolutely fundamental for nation building. If you don't have a nation, development is moot. I mean, how can you talk of India's development if there is no India, right? So to that extent, the democracy was the foundational, which laid the foundations of the nation on which you can then talk about different parts of like development, etc. So we want to make that very clear. That is an absolutely core sort of aspect, claim that the book makes.
So, just to say that, I don't think the Indian experience shows that even if you define development in terms of, let's say social indicators of, health, education, etc., the conflict, democracy, and maybe even because of democracy, for example, we talk about the education sector where, no governments did anything. And part of it because our democracy was an elite democracy and which therefore couldn't deliver some of these things as well. So the bottom line is that you don't get away from the problem just by saying in India, no, democracy is not just about growth or economics, but also about social indicators. The problem still remains.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, both. I'm curious about your take on why the feedback loops in democracy have failed despite low economic growth in Bengal and in India for a lot of years. Why do you think that happened?
So is there, the Bengalis are argumentative, debating, there's a relatively free press, it's not as, so why has that feedback loop failed?
I mean, one is the phrase you used. Maybe if you are knowledge proof, no feedback loop will ever work, right? I mean, I must confess, when we read, for this book, we ourselves were at a loss because, the usual claim among economists is, informational asymmetries. That explains, it's a buzzword used all the time for all sorts of things. No, there were no. In fact, what really surprised us and was frankly humbling for us as academics is just how well these reports were done. I mean, it's quite amazing. There's a report, on nation building. I'll just mention. It's a curiously titled report. It's called the Committee on Emotional Integration. Right? I doubt if any of you have heard it. But actually, around circa 1960-61, there were huge concerns that the nation was about to fall apart. Huge concern. And so this committee was formed with all sorts of luminaries. And it's about the software of nation building. It's about cognitive connectivity, which is what nation building is, right? As an academic, I mean, we would be proud to think as deeply as they did about these things. Now, this committee, I think, didn't make a difference. What really made a difference in nation building was that next year we had the war with China, and wars are great, like for nation building. But nonetheless, I think why these things that, as Halwin said, you thought deeply, you were not self-congratulatory, you questioned yourself, but you were not self-corrective. That has been there consistently. And,
I think just to add to Devesh, I think there's a general a kind of assumption in your thing that democracy has never, not just in India, anywhere in the world, necessarily been a very an instrument for accountability, because democracy has been much more about participation, representation, inclusiveness than about as an accountability mechanism. Partly because accountability happens all the time and not just during elections. So it's building accountability mechanisms between elections is the challenge, and then so that's why I think we overburden democracy and electoral democracy for as accountability mechanisms.
Yeah.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.